This is one I'm not sure will work. All right, welcome everybody to tonight's deep dive, which is going to be on sheltering. And the first thing I'm going to do is share my screen for the presentation, which is not a fancy presentation at all, but it was kind of the data dump I've done of what we had talked some of the people when we were doing a little bit pre-meeting conversation had talked about. Well, we remember some discussions from a couple of years ago. We've got some stuff in our book, but we haven't touched this for a little while. So that's why we're going to deep dive it and see what and where we want to go. We do have a shelter folder in our Google Drive, and this presentation is now in the Google Drive, in the trainings, in the deep dive, so that you can get to this information afterwards and get to the links if you can't think of where to find it. And I'm going to put everybody on mute there. And so the first question is, why do the hub captains even talk about shelters? Because we're thinking we're all going to be standing in a park and helping people find resources or match people to issues and information. And it really became clear to us. Okay, everybody please go to mute. It became clear to us that shelters are going to get set up in our neighborhoods because we're going to have people afraid to go back in their houses. People aren't going to know what to do. And of course, it's Seattle, it'll be raining. And so we tended to use the generic word, well, we'll open up shelters. And in some ways, we were being really naive about that. We were just saying it's a place where people can go. And that just seems so easy. And when we did this work a couple of years ago, we found out how not easy it is. It's really actually pretty complicated. And even though you think you know what you're doing, you don't. And I may have shared this at one of the hub captain meetings. Earlier this winter, the American Legion in West Seattle opened up as a overnight shelter during some severe weather. And it was for the homeless population or veterans, which is their demographic they serve. And when I went down there to say, you guys need anything, the commander was single-handedly doing this. He had about 4 people in there, and he hadn't thought about what he was doing. He didn't have any food for them. They were sleeping in different parts of the building. And he said, can you watch this for, like an hour while I go home and get some stuff together? So I'm like, sure. So I sat down and I went, well, is this safe? I mean, and it was literally just around, like, what if somebody gets hurt? I don't know where the first aid kits are. I don't know what he's told these people. Are they sleeping in these different rooms for a reason? It was just like one of those, holy moly, all those things that we put together on our checklist, I didn't go through at all. So I came back to him afterwards and I said, before you activate next time, we have some checklists that maybe you should go through and think about before you open. So there is, like Kayla and Deborah were talking about, there is this disconnect between what you do on paper and what it really takes to run a shelter. So we talk about sheltering because we may be the people doing that OJT for that church or that large room facility person who says, I can help you be a shelter, and we want to have them do it safely. So if we can help them do it safely, that's what we need to be prepared to do. So since we had started the work with the city and learning about sheltering, it was really clear it's not easy. It's super complicated. And there are many things that go into it beyond just, as I mentioned, the first thing that came to me was safety. It's accessibility. How can everybody use the facilities? There are cultural factors at play. Are you going to have people, families in one room? Are you going to have men and women together? Are you going to have, what if you have a facility where it's just one room and religious reasons say they can't stay in that same room if it's men and women? Like, how do we deal with those? And there are just a slug of laws that govern all the jurisdictional, all the way from city to state to federal, around how shelters are done. So I will say that this is Cindy's kind of layman interpretation, and I'm using the easy language. If we follow up on this, we'll get a lot better and more crisp about what it is, and not just say, yeah, and all those laws or all that stuff, but just looking at these different dimensions, you can see they're just really obvious, but you don't think about them until you actually go to do it. So in Washington, we have regional partnerships that work together. And so public health is at the state and county level, and they also cover the city. You have Red Cross, which is a national organization. You have non-governmental agencies like the Salvation Army, and there's multiple response groups like this who either have facilities or have volunteers who would come into an area after a disaster and do sheltering work. And the city of Seattle, of course, is prime for what happens within our city limits. And there's probably about 30 more, because whenever I attend a meeting on sheltering, there's so many people there and they have so many different titles, you literally can't keep track of it. And in some ways, that's possibly why it seems like sheltering is more complicated than it needs to be. But on the other hand, it's all those eyes and all those people's different responsibilities are what are trying to make a safer and more robust plan. And all these people here are the ones who would immediately, after, they've been planning for years and they keep replanning. I mean, we always have to update. And they're the ones who would, if we had an earthquake, when we'll use the Cascadia level earthquake as kind of like the talking example, they would be the ones who start opening up the shelters. It would be like disaster happens, and they would have the book where they're pulling out the playbook and going, here's who we have to contact. Here's what we wanted to do. These are the 8 primary shelters we want to open. Where is the damage? What can be opened? What can be staffed? And really then putting together the actuality of what would actually activate. And these same people are the same ones who kind of get really worried looks on their face when someone like me goes, yeah, we'll have shelters, I'm sure, opening in the churches in our neighborhoods. That really, really worries them. They call those spontaneous shelters because that's all they are. They just sort of spontaneously stand up with no pre-planning, no pre-thinking. And that is a huge concern to them around safety, food safety, accommodations, equity, all those things. So we all try to work together on this. Well, we think they're going to set up, and, I don't think anybody's going to say, no, we don't want you to set up and let your people stand in the rain, but we want to try and do something sanely. So I'm going to pause and make sure, raise your hand if you have any questions, because that's how I see you on my screen. Nothing yet. Well, that's good. I haven't lost you yet. So the concerns we had when we first were doing this was we actually didn't have a number of how long would it take for a real kind of Red Cross level, formal, officially run, professionally staffed shelter. How long would it take to open? And after the Cascadia Rising exercise, the conclusion was it would take about a week. And that would be to get one shelter open, or maybe 2. So in the city of Seattle, after a week, you would see one shelter open somewhere, and maybe 2, and then it would cascade more quickly after that, depending on how many volunteers can come in. But there's just a lot of stuff that has to happen prior to a shelter safely opening. And like the second paragraph says, there's work going on to figure out how to do it faster, or what are the alternatives to what the current model is, which is open a big giant shelter. So what I want to do is take you through the different kinds of shelters to understand how they talk about shelters and how they think about their different options. So there's 2 basic kinds of, I don't even know what the word is, types of shelters, I guess. Congregate, which means it's a big congregated room. It's a giant room with lots of cots, and everybody's all together, and you have all the problems attendant on mass people in a mass room under a highly stressful situation, and they're all eating, and they're all using the bathroom, and they're all needing to shower, and it's the classic gymnasium look. So that's called a congregate shelter. A non-congregate shelter is something that they've started using a lot more frequently, particularly with the COVID. And that is where you find a hotel and they put, 1 or 2 families in each room. So non-congregate means everybody's individually, isolated off. And that has been used by FEMA, but that's usually like way down the road, day 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, you're in a big congregate shelter until they can find places for people to transfer to out of the damage zone. And then you go live in a trailer or you go live in a hotel or something like that. And with the pandemic, you know, the the switch to how would we set up a shelter in the middle of a pandemic? The non-congregate is what people would much prefer. There was some work done earlier that said if we have to set up a congregate, we need to do things like space people differently. And I have not checked in on that, but they gave, get the cots at least 6 feet apart, head to foot, sort of thing. And I haven't come back to see if they've changed that because it's sort of like wait till the end of the pandemic and then see what they've finally settled on. So these are two types of shelters. And then there are how the shelters can be set up. So if you're in a gymnasium, people would just call that a congregate shelter. There's a thing called a soft-sided shelter. And that is where you don't use an actual building, you use a large tent or something that can be set up. And that's why it's called soft-sided, a series of canopies, put up together where you can then line up the cots in the large tent. And you can still have a soft-sided non-congregate shelter, which would be a park where they've gridded off 10 feet squares and people come out and set up their tents. And that was also something they wanted to try out in Cascadia Rising was, I believe the Parks Department did get a park gridded off, but they never got all the way to the step of getting volunteers to come set up their tents and see how that works. So, so the connection to the next line is around. So all I've been talking about is where you're sleeping, right? There shelters, a traditional shelter. If I said to somebody, "Well, you're going to go to a shelter," their brain would go, "I'm going to go get a bed. I'm going to get fed. I will have hopefully a place to shower, but for sure a place to go to the bathroom." And so that's in their model. And if you did a soft side shelter, you'd have to be bringing in porta potties. You'd have to be setting up another tent for the feeding. You'd have to be setting up another tent for the information zone, or the processing of the people, because you don't just show up at a shelter and go, "This is my bed." You get checked in and checked out. There's definitely procedures. We're going to come to that. So one of the things we also have to think about is like managing the expectations of people is like, yeah, we're going to send you down the street to a church. They're a shelter, but be aware you need to bring your own food, or be aware, no showers. So, and then I did not get, what I didn't do is I didn't bring up copies of these 4 pages from the pandemic. I have it here, and it's how they're going to do different sheltering differently during a pandemic. For example, feeding practices in shelters. Food will not be served in bulk. That's how shelters typically are. You walk down the line and you get this handed out stuff. Individual meals will be produced by vendors. All staff handling the food have to wear, the 50 kinds of PPE, set it down and step it back method. So there's new pandemic guidelines that will be incorporated, I'm sure, into these shelter plans. So questions so far? Oh, this is great. We put in the Hub Captain book the tools. So I just wanted for the new people to, the one thing we did was we had met with the City of Seattle Human Services Division and a member of the King County Medical Reserve Corps who was an expert on shelters. And between the two of them, we adopted some of the checklists that they used for setting up their own sheltering. And we, tailored it down to what we thought a neighborhood level church, for example, could do. So there's 4 items that are in there. And check it. Okay. So the first one was just a checklist for the location to decide if they could even open safely. And that was like my guy at the American Legion, where if he'd come to me, I'd say, here you go. You know, like, do you have food? Do you have a men's and a women's restroom? Are you going to scale how many people you let in if you only have one toilet and 4 rolls of toilet paper left? So it's a checklist for them to go through and go, is this going to even make sense, or is it going to make things worse for people? And then the second checklist is actually to help them make some of those decisions that they may not have thought of. How to deal with families, how to there is a concern about sex offenders getting into shelters. There is concern about children in shelters. What if the parents have to leave to go register for, you know, FEMA aid, and are they going to leave the kids there? How will you deal with, you know, unattended children? Will you allow unattended children? So the third thing we put in there was a registration form, and this was really requested by the city. It seems like a lot of paperwork, but it's a practice used at all shelters so that they know who's there. I mean, everybody's trying to account for, in a disaster like an earthquake, is somebody still alive? So if somebody has shown up at a shelter and nobody knows they're there, and we've got frantic digging going on back at their house, you know, did that make sense? So registration forms so that the city can actually track who is there. And then the city can also use those registration forms to ask people to go through the registration forms about how many people do you have? How many children do you have? Because then they can start the bulk ordering of food or other items that they might bring in. So if they're setting up a big shelter and they've decided the place that they're going to do it is in the north end of Seattle, and it turns out that there's 62 little baby shelters, spontaneous shelters down in the south end of Seattle that they didn't even know about, they have not served everybody. They need to know what's going on all across the city. And that is the point of the last one, which is a form so that the shelter can keep communicating back to us. Are they filling up? What do they need? You know, what is it they're offering? If somebody can't take children, you know, let's not send a family with 5 kids down to some place that they're going to get turned away from. So those are the 4 tools that we put in place and are just kind of sitting in the Hub Captain's books. They all got printed off and issued to you. The problem is there's just one copy. And so, you know, it's going to be one of those, think about how if you have 3 people who are offering to open up a shelter, you know, can they take a picture of these and bring them back, or what are we going to do? So it's one of those things to worry about, because we know what we need to do, but we haven't really figured out the mechanism to do it. The questions on what we've done so far and is in place in our Hub Captain book. Okay, I cannot be this good, so there better be a lot of questions at the end. I'm trying to be thorough, but not that I know I'm missing something. So I've had questions from people that they're, you know, like, well, so how can we get better on doing this? And so Deborah Widmer had put together a shelter communications toolkit. And it's not necessarily like the whole how to run a shelter. It does cover much of it, but what it also does is it covers 2 things. It covers accessibility, which means it's a very good resource for communications. So how do you think about when you're looking for putting in a place a shelter, and you want to make it accessible to all, and communication issues come along with making accessible to all? How do you get around those? So I believe she's found some extra copies. And if anybody has been working with a sheltering partner already, that you might want to get a hand on this, now's the time to tell Deborah you'd like one. Deborah, is there anything you'd like to add about that?
About the toolkit specifically, we have some hard copies in a bound, really sturdy notebook on very sturdy hard copy paper. And there's also a digital version, which you'll get a USB drive with the digital files if you want the hard copy. But if you don't want the hard copy, we can just give you a little USB with the digital files. So whatever way works best for you. The hard copy also has some signage you can use. It has the graphics communications toolkit, which is not toolkit, graphics communications card, which is a visual tool that can be helpful for communications, and it's all ready to go. So there's some things in there that might be helpful to you.
And then the next thing I'd found, because I'd been asked about, well, good job. Is Red Cross doing any training? I don't believe they're doing any training right now just because of COVID, but they do have a class that's called Shelter Fundamentals. And it takes you through, we're shelter light, they're shelter professional. And so it takes you through all the, the phases that they think about. As soon as you open, you need to be thinking about how you're going to close. So it takes you through that entire cycle. They have them both instructor-led and online, but they have to make them available online. They do them as a class, not as at your desire, as far as I know. But you can go and download the book. And so you'll get a look at what a full shelter toolkit would look like. And then I was going to ask Kayla to say a few words about where she was on the status of the shelter plan for Renton.
So where I'm at with the shelter plan for Renton is everything is completed in draft form, and I am just awaiting approval and review from the powers that be. But what we did was we took the Red Cross training book basically and some other best practices documentation and made a comprehensive preparedness all the way to demobilization and recovery book specific for government. And then we made some just-in-time trainings for different roles and positions within the shelter, and some different forms that Red Cross mentions, but Red Cross in their training mentions, for example, a staff meeting that's held semi-regularly, and here are some things you should talk about. So we actually created an agenda that's just a fill-in agenda for that. So we created some things like that. The one thing I will say is, and I think Deb will probably agree, the thing that research and all of the people that have actually run a shelter have told me is the thing to remember is the problems that people had prior to the disaster are still going to exist after the disaster, and may often, the disaster is very likely going to compound those issues. So that's just something to remember and to keep in mind as well.
Yeah, that's good, because when we did the psychological first aid class, the basis of offering that class was for shelter workers. It was just, we had to redo that class a whole lot for the hub captains, because we had to keep saying, no, we don't have a professional psychologist sitting here with us. That's maybe in a shelter, that is helping people with, having mental crisis, but not here, so that is a very good observation about, people's issues still will be with them.
Well, and as you said, Cindy, sheltering is very complicated. So anybody that wants to talk with me and nerd out over sheltering, I could probably scare you actually out of doing it.
No, see, that's why somebody else is doing it. I'm just helping them. Okay, so then this was really kind of my last thing. The things I know that are going on are COVID stopped everything, but there was going to be some updates to sheltering plan, and the Seattle feeding plan or food plan is also still in work too. There's a whole lot of, like pause, because people want to make sure that they incorporate any pandemic stuff. And so our work group for the hubs have been, trying to keep up on that. And, we'll continue to work on that, but it affects how we set up our hubs and how people set up the shelters. And I know we're going to want to engage with the city again, just to catch up with where they are. I don't know that the forms are going to, that is useful, to update those. That might be a little side work, but it is really doing what we're doing tonight, which is, hopefully the feedback from you guys is this is useful and you understand that there's issues now, and it's not just snap your fingers and then open a shelter. And then our Q&A with them is, what can we do to be better about what we might have to do? Or is there something we have to say to the city, you have to do better? We cannot wait a week to have one shelter in the North End open up and, 600,000 other people get to figure it out on their own. And then through, whether we go through the city or we do it with, there's a regional planning effort that's in work, and Deborah might want to end up speaking to this too, that she's going to be working on for the mass care sheltering plan. And that's, I think, another year's worth of work in front of us. So do you want to have anything you want to say about that, Deborah?
I have a lot of things I want to say about a lot of things.
Well, this is literally my last slide, folks. So I'm going to take it off the slide and then let's have some dialogue.
So, yeah, I'll just really quickly, and if people want, let me know. I can give you kind of a status of where we are in the city right now around shelter, both shelter planning and kind of shelter operations, which we're doing right now and have been doing for a while. So we can talk about that. But for those of you who don't know, I work for the city, but my position is entirely funded through the Department of Homeland Defense and Security, through FEMA. And I work regionally. And for us, that is the 3 counties, King County, Pierce County, and Snohomish County, and the cities of Bellevue and the city of Seattle. It's officially called the Seattle Metropolitan UASI, which is Urban Area Security Initiative region. And of course, you didn't want to know any of that. But that's kind of the minutia of it. And because of that, what I do is I have to every year put in projects that they fund. And the project that they have funded that I'm starting literally like this week and will probably run for 12, maybe 14 months, is I've been asked to work with all of our regional partners to develop a regional emergency mass care shelter plan. And that's huge. We're talking, maybe needing to shelter more than 100, 200,000 people after a major event. And the first year of the planning process will be probably looking more at a Cascadia scenario, because that's what we normally plan for and what this project was originally developed to plan for, and then COVID. So now we need to overlay any kind of pandemic or bioterrorism or hazmat, any kind of big thing like that over a shelter plan, right? And we can't do that without public health. And public health has no bandwidth in 2021 to do anything except COVID. So what we're doing is dividing it into 2 years. And the first year will be just a plan. And the second year will be a plan overlaid by some kind of public health crisis. And there would be, it has to be have a connection to terrorism. So it'll be a bioterrorism scenario, perhaps a CBRN, which is chemical bioterrorism, nuclear. I can't remember what the last one stands for, but it's like the biggest of biggest kind of bad things that can happen. And that's what the federal government really wants us to plan for, is the worst of the worst. So we'll overlay all of that on for a second year of planning. This is big. I don't have a lot of details right now. We're putting together the planning team, community groups, and someone, more than one or from these hubs will definitely be part of that team. I am all about whole community planning. This can't just be the government. It has to be our nonprofit and community partners in figuring out how to do this. It's a huge lift. So that work kicks off now, and I'll be coming back to this group at some point next spring to talk about real involvement and have some conversations. And I'm happy to answer any questions about the city stuff or about regional stuff that you have. Thank you for letting me talk about this project.
Okay, can't unmute on my little face. So Deborah, but your work is still aligned with it's got to be professional. It can't be fast and sloppy. It's got to conform to all the requirements. So we still have that gap window of what do we do between it happens and the cavalry rides in, right?
Well, let me talk about that just a little bit. So it kind of depends on what the big thing that happens is. Right now, first there's the homelessness response where we're doing a tremendous amount of sheltering. And that's a huge amount of experience that helps us learn about sheltering in general. And then secondly, even just only going back 2 years for Snowmageddon. And then last year at the beginning, believe it or not, we started out this year with snow. Not that anybody remembers January anymore. So we've had 2 major snow events where we have opened shelters in our community center. So we know how to actually do that when the building is safe, when it has electricity, and when we can, call the staff and say, hey, show up, we're going to open a shelter. And we've successfully done that now. The problem comes about when the other stuff happens. So earthquake happens. Now we have to find out, is the building habitable and safe? Does it have power and water? Are the roads getting to the building safe, and can we get people there safely? So all of those things take time to figure out, to get the experts out to look at the buildings, to make the decisions. And I would agree that a week is probably very realistic. I would love to say we can get it done sooner, and we might, if we can really get on the ball and snap and everything goes really well and we've got decent weather and everything lines up well. We could do it sooner, but it really depends on the building and the infrastructure and the utilities and the roads. And those are big things that take a lot of work to fix. And so that's why I think we talk about that week. I don't like the fact that kind of leaves people out hanging, trying to figure out what to do in the meantime. None of us like that. Let's talk about that a little bit. Jill Watson, who originally did the presentation, I think for you guys that a lot of this came from, she's our expert on sheltering. She's my colleague in the Human Services Department. And she likes to say that, and I would agree with her, this comes from the Red Cross, going to a shelter is someone's last option, right? First, they want to stay at home if they can. If they can't, they want to go to a friend or a relative, right? If they have the means to get out of the area or to go to a hotel that's open, they do that. There's a lot of things that they try. I've heard some people say, hey, I'm pitching a tent outside in front of my house and staying in my own property and taking care of myself. I'm not going to argue with that. We've got REI here. A lot of people have the means to do that kind of thing. So yeah, there's other options that you guys can do. And I don't honestly think in the first 24, 48 hours, that 100,000 people will be stampeding looking for a shower or looking for a shelter to open up. They'll be looking for a shower maybe, but I don't think they're going to necessarily be looking for a shelter. As the situation unfolds after the first 24, 48 hours, we've got, aftershocks. People are starting to get more and more nervous about staying in homes that might not be totally damaged, but just feel uncomfortable to be in. Now you're starting to get people who don't want to be under their own roofs. Some of them don't want to be under a hard roof at all, which is why soft-sided sheltering, we see that internationally all over the place after a major earthquake, because that's a safe place for a lot of people. We are planning for soft-sided sheltering, and it's funny because I like to say when we have these meetings, look, people, we're going to show up at Woodland Park, and it's not going to be pristine where we can just draw lines on the ground. There are going to be 100 people already there with tents. You guys are going to get there ahead of us, and I don't blame you. And I know of some community groups, including myself, and I actually live up on North Beacon Hill. So I promise not to be too prejudiced with our own hub up here. But I've had neighbors who have said, hey, you guys can all come. We've got an empty lot. That's what it is. Across the street from me, the house is 2 lots and one of them is empty. And they have said, come pitch your tents. You can come and we'll set up a little camp right here where we're all still in this neighborhood. And you know what? If I didn't do this for a living, that would be my choice, because it would keep me near my house. It would keep me near my neighbors and with a support system I feel I could trust. So
well, do you think?
So anyway, I'm just saying that there's a lot of options out there that people are going to do and think about.
Well, but I think that's kind of the point is, we've sort of just gone, we'll be lucky and a church will be open. We as hubs and neighborhood groups can be more proactive about it. And it's not managing expectations, but it's like giving people other alternatives, and I know Ann Forrest has talked about this of, hey, as soon as an earthquake happens, have her hub is kind of like centrally organized and located around a park. It's like, send the guy with the spray paint out and mark out 10-foot grids so that you start with
Mhm.
the 10-foot grids in place, the right aisleways in place, an information area marked out, and the future porta potty location marked. I mean, we can actually, incorporate that kind of thinking.
Mhm.
We'd have to work with, the city and the parks to say, and, you know, do you want to have input on it, or you just want us to let us, mark what we think is right?
Mhm. Those of you who have been around for the hubs for a while know that I love you guys. And this is exactly why, and why I stay involved and really support what you do, because you are our frontline workers. You are the first ones that people are going to show up at your hub and ask questions. And I love the urban survival skills classes you do, and all those ways that keep people resilient and self-sufficient, because those are people that are able to take care of themselves until the cavalry can get here. Whether that's the city opening up a community center shelter that can take people in, or whether that's when we finally get FEMA and all of the supplies, through the broken transportation system and get them here so that people can start, we can giving out food and giving out all that kind of stuff. Until the cavalry arrives, the more self-sufficient and resilient you guys and the community can be, the better off we all are. So I'm all for everything you're learning here, and anything that you guys want. If you really want to deep dive, there are classes you can take, and the more you learn, it's hard and it's complicated, but the better off I think you'll be in terms of being able to help your neighbors.
Okay. So let me turn this over to anybody else have questions for Deborah or Kayla or, okay, I see Frank waving his hand.
Cindy, yeah, you mentioned earlier on with spontaneous shelters, there was concern for jurisdictional protocols by the Red Cross, Public Health, and everything. Did I hear that correctly?
No, it's not, it's not a jurisdictional issue. It's are you going to do it safely issue, you know? Or
Right.
is it going to be like my guy at the American Legion, where fortunately the 4 people in the room in the building were all men? What if there'd been 2 women and 2 men? What if one of it had been a kid?
Right. So one of it flips back for me to are there liability issues to setting up something spontaneously?
Well, there we go with liability again.
Well, no, I know, because that's, when I go to talk to people in the public, the chambers and everything, that's one of the first things they ask. So, and I'm not asking for a deep dive on a definition of it now. It's just,
It's I'm still waiting for the final
Right.
wording from the legislator to see what the Good Samaritan law is going to get changed to.
okay, I'll let it go at that. That's good.
Yeah. I mean, other questions? So I have a question of all of you. I'm always interested in this stuff. I love working this stuff. I love problem solving and getting in front of the problem and going, great, if we have to have a chapter on how to, mark our parks up and how to, think about setting up safe shelters, well, let's do it. But I don't want to keep doing all this. Is there anybody else who'd be interested in working on this as a specific topic? Like we've got the COVID committee going. We've got a couple other little working groups, and stuff gets done that way. Is there anybody who's interested in working sheltering? I mean, I realized today was just the general info and we're missing a lot of our experts.
I would do it, Cindy.
Well, I would have roped you in no matter what. So,
Well, and I just thinking about the sheltering light, and I would be interested to hear what Deb has to say is, so we talked about congregate and non-congregate shelters. It gets a little bit finer than that. And so one of the things they talk about is evacuation shelters, which are intended to be temporary spaces. You give people less space, square footage of space. You have to have snacks on hand, not necessarily meals. And so it would be interesting to see if the city had any interest in us possibly saying, look, we'll be the evacuation shelters until you can stand something up. And so basically what happens is people go to these evacuation shelters, and then from there, as shelters open up, they get funneled or transported to the larger shelter. And I don't know if there would be any interest in that or what the logistics would include in that, but that might be one way to kind of figure out this whole sheltering light and how we can help the city.
I think what they've done is they've, what you called an evacuation shelter, which would be traditional in a tornado or hurricane where they're really going to evacuate them. That's what they're calling a spontaneous shelter. Jill really struggled for a word that she could call us, because it was like, okay, if you're going to stand up, we're going to put you out of business as fast as we can. But we recognize that people are still going to collect. Right. And so I think that they've acknowledged that we are those things, and they want to know how many of those things we've got going on. We just are just, it's like a prayer that, the church who told me 2 years ago that they were going to come down and say, yeah, we can help, really shows up, or am I going to be going, gosh, folks, I don't have any place for you, but there's a park over there that you can jump into. So I think that's a good concept to talk about, and that's why I was probing at Deborah, that 1 week period, like what we got to be able to do better than just go have a seat for a while and the city will get to you in a while.
Well, and I don't think we're actively giving that message out, although I can see why it feels that way. And to be honest, in some ways, feeding is going to be the more immediate problem, food and water. As Cindy knows, and some of you have been involved in, I know Anne was part of this, we've been doing, before COVID, we've been doing some isolation workshops and conversations. So, okay, big earthquake, everything shut down. We're gonna be pretty isolated here as a region from the major supply chains. And so, and even like the Red Cross, right? If the people that are here already, they're impacted. And by the time we can get all these groups like the Red Cross and Salvation Army that aren't already here, get them in to help as the cavalry and to bring in supplies, food and water and blankets and that sort of thing, we're stuck with what we've got, right? So we've been having those conversations. What do we do if we've got X number of time, whether that's 5 days, 7 days before anybody gets here? What do we have within the city limits? And that's the conversation we have at the city. What do we have to feed people, to give water, to do all those things that we have to do? Those are interesting conversations. I want to send everybody out fishing, by the way, so start saving worms. I just feel like there's a lot of creativity, and those might be interesting conversations for you guys to have too. But that's kind of what we're also talking about, is then how can we help support the community in all of those ways, but mostly around food and water, which is going to be your biggest problem in the first couple of days.
Yeah, Gabrielle has her hand up.
So I've been thinking, as you've been talking, Cindy and Deborah, about this whole thing of, oh, there's a park over there. Well, I live near the park that they don't want anyone to go to, right? I live by Magnuson, as does Patty. And I'm just thinking about what that's going to look like if a whole lot of people don't want to be in their building, either people who live in Magnuson or the many different communities that live right around Magnuson. And people are going to go and set up on those enormous ball fields. And that's exactly where the city doesn't want anyone to be. So I'm not really questioning, I'm just kind of mulling that over. What is that going to look like if people are in condos or apartments and for some reason want to leave their house? It's a lot of single family homes where people could stay in their yard, but not everybody would have that option. So
yeah,
that's right. And especially Belltown and Capitol Hill.
All the rules go out the window.
Yeah, in the first couple of days, just do what you need to do to survive. I mean, that's what everybody will be doing. Even those of us who make our way into the EOC or wherever we're doing our work, we're figuring out what's going on. What do we need? Who's been impacted? Where's the damage? It's going to take time. And you're right. As much as
would we tell people, would we say, look, you could go to Magnuson, but they're probably going to come and move you in a couple days?
Yeah,
I mean, would that be the message?
Yeah, to be honest, that's probably exactly what I would say. And it might not be a couple of days, because you're right. We have quite a few public spaces that we've designated for other things. Like, this is where we're going to put hazardous material, or this is where we're going to set up some kind of a place to give away, distribute goods, or we may have other uses for those places. But we're not putting signs up, and we're not telling people that ahead of time. Those places might not be suitable even for what we want to use them for. Yes. So, I mean, just being completely realistic with you, maybe not speaking like for the mayor or the city. In those first couple of days, do what you have to do to stay safe and to survive and to help each other. And as we can pick it up and come in, people will do that as best we can. We'll come to the rescue as much as we can, but do what you have to do to survive. And
Yeah, I
we'll have
think-
to deal with it.
I think that's a helpful message because I don't think that would have been what I would have done since I can be a, rule follower person. But
Well-
I think that's really helpful to at least to think about it that way. And that might change, but yeah, thank you.
The part of Magnuson, because it is so unique, Ann and I had a conversation with the manager of the community center there, Brian Judd, and we're working on hubcap bench strength at that location. And that's probably going to be part of that conversation. We know the hub captain's going to know that eventually they're going to want to put debris there. And if you have to have people soft side shelter, do it as far away from where you think trucks are going to go. And there's some flexibility around it. It's just everybody being aware of each other's plans is kind of important. And that's been the good thing about this dialogue with the city is like, then you don't have 1,000 people you got to move that you had no idea that you were going to have to move. So, hey, the one other thing I forgot that I said I would make sure I figure out how to do is I believe it is in the city of Seattle's earthquake annex or one of their planning documents where it describes which are and this is the super caveat, which are the designated primary shelters if the building's standing, the staff can be made, you can get to them if that's where the need is. But at least it tells you what their planned considerations are. And then that helped us know which shelters are considered the primaries, like likelihood, these are the highest ones to open up, and which ones have the generators. And so I will see if I can find that document because since it's publicly on their website, it's at least shareable, but manage people's expectations where they just will listen to you and go, oh, Greenwood Senior Center, I'm perfect, I'll be there, and they don't hear the part about it's a possibility. So, other questions, anybody else got anything?
Susan and Patricia have their hands up. Oh, yep. Patricia put hers down. Susan still has hers up.
Okay, sorry, my cursor was over that. Susan, go ahead.
No problem. I just see, can you hear me? Okay, I
Yes.
had to unmute. I just see like West Seattle in particular, maybe Vashon kind of, we are the areas that are pretty much connected by bridges. And if there is an earthquake, which is what we've been talking about, we are the areas where, and like the beach will liquefy. It's fill. We have no bridges. No one's going to be able to come over here. And I think we will be an area that will have to be one of those that starts sheltering and starts looking around for food and water. I mean, foraging, if nothing else, because, it's not like anyone's going to be able to drive over here unless you go down to Tukwila. I think these are, and just like Vashon, I mean, that's connected to the main areas by bridges. I think areas like us have a particular need for some of this, or am I looking at this wrong?
So for folks, Susan is a brand new hub captain. I mean, I think she's in month 2 here. So I owe her a whole lot of background still. You are exactly right, Susan. That's why West Seattle works together as hard as it does to say, we have to be individually resilient and work across the whole peninsula to deal with the resources that we're here trapped with, because we probably won't have bridges and we'll be driving way south to get around. So I'll be following up with you when I get back home. So.
Cindy,
Thank
can I
you.
add one more thing?
And then after Deborah, Patricia, Patty has her hand up.
Just really quickly, so the city's been working with a company the last couple of years on something called One Concern. And what it is a modeling, it's a computer AI, so artificial intelligence. It actually learns as it goes. And it's a way for us to model what happens in certain kind of earthquakes. And what we have learned that I think shocked many of us is that the different kinds of faults and earthquakes that Seattle can have can have very different results. So one of them, the north end, will have very little damage. So north of the Chip Canal is not impacted nearly as much as the south end of the Ship Canal. Another fault, like the fault off Cascadia, is going to have a different set of impacts. There are about 5 different scenarios that we've been able to run that have helped us to kind of visualize and map out where those islands might form and why, and really get a sense of, you know, where the fault was. What fault blew? Was it the Seattle fault? Was the epicenter over on the east side, like under Issaquah, or was it south or north, or where was it? And what does that do? And so when something goes sideways, the very first question you should ask is, where was it? What fault blew and where was the epicenter? That's going to give all of us a little bit more information about where the damage is. We were particularly, I know I was particularly shocked, and I think many were surprised at the difference in the damage between Cascadia and the Seattle fault. It's very different areas of damage and types of damage. So there's a lot yet that we're still learning about all of this. And so don't make too many assumptions, because they're not all alike. I guess that's what I want to say.
Okay, Patty.
Yeah, I was just gonna ask, like,
Oh, wait a minute. Patty, I muted you. I'm sorry.
yeah, so, what is the typical reaction, or not reaction, but I guess in supermarkets, do they just like let it all go and everybody runs in and gets what they want? Or I guess what happens in an earthquake to supermarkets?
Well,
So-
I'm sorry, Cindy, you go ahead.
Yeah, and I'm gonna say that is not a sheltering question. I want to see if there's,
Okay.
we're kind of like at our hour. Is there any other sheltering questions before we go down that road? So, and the last thing before I go on to that. So Kayla, you know, I'll circle back to you on what we'll do with this next year. As Deborah had already observed, we can't do anything until public health and the city come out of dealing with the pandemic. So, you know, we got a little time, but I was glad to get everybody caught up on this. So Patty, back to your question. Every supermarket is different. You would hope they have a business continuity plan. Some of your larger ones like Safeway and QFC and Trader Joe's, they have corporate instructions. Like if Trader Joe's power is out, they're supposed to close down. And so we have to work with our local. Frank had done some really yeoman's work working with his Thriftway to get a memo of agreement that said, in a disaster, we're going to want to, you know, you empty your shelves so that people don't go hungry, but we want to do it in a way that is not like looting and gets the food to the people who need it, not somebody his 24th case of toilet paper. So it's a case by case answer for every grocery store. Your larger ones have protocols that they'll slam into place. Your smaller ones aren't going to know what to do, and they're probably going to be your best resource in a disaster, because they're the ones going, oh, we never thought this would happen. What do we do? So get someone down there to help them. Say, lock your doors, get people to line up, you know, open your doors, give everything away, but, you know, start talking with your business districts around what they all plan to do.
I know too, some of the larger, I don't know about in this area, but some of the larger grocery chains have emergency managers. So for example, is it Heb or Hebe or HEB in Texas, the big grocery chain in Texas? They actually have an emergency manager, and they're one of the most prepared grocery store chains in the nation. I would be willing to bet that Kroger or Safeway or one of those probably has someone too in that position who's created those plans.
Ooh, I saw my first HEB shopping yesterday. I'm going to go look on, see if they got bulletin boards or something.
There's a
Frank?
really cool article I can send you about their emergency preparedness.
I would love that. Frank, you had your hand up.
If Deb would repeat that IT model from the city, I thought I heard one concern, as in ONE concern, because I want to follow up on that, because I live in Magnolia and we are the Vashon of Seattle if we lose 3 bridges.
So it's a company out of Silicon Valley that we've been working with. And probably the best person to reach out to, I can connect you with TJ McDonald at the Office of Emergency Management. He's been running that program for the city. I'm on the team that's been testing the program and using it to do all kinds of prognostications to try to figure out what we're going to do, and mostly estimating numbers and location.
Right.
So maybe you and I could connect offline and I can introduce you.
Sure, that'd be great, because what we did years ago, we set up some potential local resources and sort of memorandums of understanding that we could use their parking lot for things.
Hmm.
But one of the things I noticed is when Thriftway went to Met Market, you got to redo it. So you got to stay on top of what you set up, because they're not going to honor the same thing the previous company did. Thank you.
I'm happy to connect you with him. I'll do that.
Okay.
With the one concern, how much of that will be fed into the virtual hazard mitigation thing that the city has, where you can click on flooding and it'll show you where the likely places are that flood? And will that be updated or won't be?
No, it won't be. It can't be integrated into that. It's a separate virtual platform. We don't own it. We just have access to the virtual platform that the company owns. And they just recently updated it. It was just the city of Seattle data. Now they've added data for all of King County, which is going to be really helpful. Earthquakes and other disasters don't know jurisdiction. So, we really have to be able to look at across jurisdictional lines, particularly in places like West Seattle and South there, where we've got that King County line and where we butt up against, nobody knows who's in city or county. So it's been a really good asset to help us do planning. And Cindy, before we leave, let me know, I'd like to do one last thing about sheltering. So
I see no other hands, and so I was ready to call it an evening. So go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to let everybody know, since we're having this great conversation, and some of you may be shelter nerds. So we work on this on an ongoing basis, even through COVID. Over the summer, in the spring, we did wildfire smoke planning, so that if we had significant wildfire smoke and air quality issues, we could have done some sheltering if we needed to over the summer. And now we're doing winter weather planning. And what are we going to do? The mayor's office specifically gave us a direction to have plans available to open shelters for the general public should we lose electricity for more than 2 or 3 days. That's our trigger for winter weather here in this area, just so you know. It's power outage. That's where we would say, okay, now people can't stay at home, they can't shelter in place without power. So now we need to open some shelters for those who need them. So Thursday, after tomorrow, Parks Department, Human Services Department, a bunch of us who do sheltering in the city are holding a tabletop exercise to practice this exact thing. How do you open? It's actually 2 general population shelters and 2 population shelters for people who are still living on the streets, because we do those populations separately right now. That's a whole nother conversation. But for winter weather, that's how we would do that. So anyway, I want you to know we're working on this. It's an active thing, even with COVID. And we're doing a tabletop exercise on Thursday. So I just want you to know we're not just sitting around trying to figure this out. We really are working on this on an active basis. So, but we really appreciate all of you.
You've been working. It's just everybody's working on a handicap here. So, all right. I thank everybody for tuning in. I will eventually send out that information. And like I said, the recording will go into our deep dive folder, and this presentation is already there if anybody wanted to go look at it. So thank you all. Have a lovely rest of your evening. Good night.
Thank you. This was great.
Thank you.
You're welcome.